This is Eric Hahn with Maritime Reporter TV, here today with Jase Ousley, Deputy Chief of Navigation Operations and Regulatory Division with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to discuss the dredging market in and around the United States. Jase, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
To start off, can you give us a personal and professional background with insight on your tenure and experience in the dredging industry, as well as the scope of your position and responsibility today?
Yes, so my name is Jase Ousley. I'm the Deputy Chief of Navigation and Operations and Regulatory here at the Corps headquarters. I've been with the Corps for about 16 years now. I started in engineering in the Jacksonville district, working in navigation and beach nourishment projects that both involve dredging. I spent a couple years as a researcher at the Engineer Research and Development Center in the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory. I've also worked in operations in Portland, Oregon as a technical lead on a large pipeline dredging contract that worked in the Columbia River. Then for the last 4 years, I was working as the dredging program manager here at the Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. But a few weeks ago, I moved over to the deputy chief of navigation job. As the deputy, I'm responsible for the navigation budget development and overall execution of our navigation program, supporting the chief of navigation, Tiffany Burrows, and our program managers working on the various facets of our mission: coastal, inland, floating plant, environmental, dredging and dredged material placement and management, and supplemental work.
I know most watching today will know the Corps and its involvement in and around the United States waterways, but can you kick off with a by-the-numbers look at the Army Corps and its dredging work? I'm really looking to get at the numbers that give a size, shape, and scale to the Corps and its dredging.
Absolutely. So the Corps' navigation mission is to provide safe, reliable, efficient, effective, and environmentally sustainable waterborne transportation systems for the movement of commerce, national security needs, and recreation. The U.S. marine transportation industry supports $2 trillion in commerce annually, with half of the consumer goods that are bought by Americans passing through harbors that are maintained by the Corps. The Corps is responsible for 13,000 miles of coastal and deep draft channels. We have 12,000 miles of commercial inland and intracoastal waterways, and then 1,072 coastal Great Lakes and inland harbors. The channels and the waterways have specified widths and depths to ensure safe vessel transit. And then sediments and occasionally debris will migrate into the channel from natural processes. So the Corps uses specialized dredging equipment to physically remove those sediments from the channels and waterways. On an average, we dredge about 240 million cubic yards of sediment. So that's enough dirt to fill the Washington Monument 750 times annually. So that's a lot of material. Over the last couple years, Congress has given the Corps historical appropriations for navigation infrastructure to support the American people and the economy, not including the FY22 bipartisan infrastructure law that added an extra $500 million. We've been executing annual appropriations of about $4 billion, where somewhere near half of that goes to dredging. Dredging is primarily done through contracts with the commercial dredging fleet. So FY23, we issued contracts to over 24 large and 53 small dredging businesses for $1.3 billion and $358 million, respectively.
Currently, what are the primary drivers for dredging activities? What are the busiest parts of the country right now for dredging?
There are three main drivers for dredging activities: our routine operations and maintenance, or O&M. That's how I have to be careful not to acronymize everything. So operation and maintenance, or O&M. And then we have construction, which is deepening and widening. And then coastal storm risk reduction, or sand mitigation, which is basically building beaches and dunes for coastal structure, or for coastal resilience and infrastructure. The need to dredge is cyclically driven by things like shoaling, spring freshets in the rivers, inclement storms, hurricanes, weather, and protected species. For example, we have windows to avoid right whales during their calving season on the East Coast. I looked this up before we started chatting. Today, there are over 100 dredges of different types working in California, Hawaii, the Gulf of Mexico, and along the East Coast of the United States. Harbors in Alaska and the Great Lakes are iced in at the moment. So we'll be doing work there, but for now we're putting out contracts for the for the coming dredging season. And I would say that our busiest part of the AOR right now is in the Gulf of Mexico.
Currently, what are your priority projects or geographic areas for U.S. dredging activities, specifically the areas that are most central to the U.S. economy?
So the Corps' budget is performance-based and prioritizes projects with the highest economic, environmental, and public safety returns to the nation across the portfolio. One of the major factors considered for routine O&M navigation work is the tonnage through the waterway or the harbor. The top 10 ports by tonnage in the US are in Texas and South Louisiana, servicing the Mississippi River and tributaries, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, and California. Additionally, we have 12 deepening projects that are under construction with a heavy concentration in the Texas coast. And there are multiple studies ongoing investigating the economics and federal interest of deepening other ports to better accommodate larger vessels. So this sort of identifies our priority projects, those with the highest economic, environmental, and public safety returns to the nation. But our primary mission is to ensure that all of our portfolio is operating at its best.
Water levels on the Mississippi River are always a concern. What's the situation today? And an overview, can you discuss the most dire dredging needs on this critical system?
The Mississippi River poses a unique challenge. Today, we're in a good spot, having recently ended low water operations, but we've been feeling the effects of weather extremes acutely in the river system, from record high water in 2019 to extreme low water events for the last 2 years. During high water events, the river undergoes rapid and extreme shoaling from around the head of passes out to the mouth of the river, and that places a really high demand on the dredges from the commercial dredging fleet. And then during low water events, we require greater dredging further up in the river system. That's frequently done by a combination of our core and our industry dredges. This last year, our dredging industry partners played a really key role building the saltwater sill in the lower part of the river to prevent saltwater from the Gulf of Mexico intruding up in and getting into the municipal freshwater intakes in New Orleans and the communities along the river.
How is climate change and all that it entails, from rising sea levels and the occurrence of larger, more frequent storms and the impacts on coastal communities, impacting the Corps' dredging fleet and planning?
In addition to those challenges that I just mentioned, with climate driving the high and the low water in the Mississippi River, the Corps constructs an average of about 10 beach nourishment projects a year to protect upland infrastructure from hurricanes and coastal storms. This project count can be in the 20s after a particularly active hurricane season. So, beach nourishment involves removing sediments from offshore or upland sand sources and placing that material on a beach. More frequent and intense storms shortens the life of those beaches, and it results in a greater need for sand, which is a non-renewable natural resource. As we exhaust the sediment deposits that are near shore, our partners in the dredging industry are challenged to build economically viable projects for the taxpayers with dredging equipment capable of removing sediments from further offshore at greater depths with longer haul distances. Meeting that need by adapting or recapitalizing dredge plant can be extremely costly to the enterprise. But climate resiliency is strongly supported through initiatives like the beneficial use of dredged material, or BU. BU is when we use our O&M sediments for productive and positive things like beach placement or marsh creation or nourishing agricultural fields. From 1998 to 2021, the Corps used about 30% of our dredged material beneficially. And then in January of 2023, the Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General Spellman, challenged the Corps to reach and sustain 70% BU by the year 2030. So that's one of the greatest commitments that to sustainability that the Corps has made. Just over a year later, we're hard at work doing that. We're aligning our data systems and going through those processes. A great example of where BU and climate change meet is in New Jersey. There, our Philadelphia district works with our congressional and state and resource agencies and local stakeholders to renourish coastal marsh areas with dredge material to combat the rising sea levels there. And accomplishing that beneficial use takes a lot of pre-planning. There are several elements and stars that must align, like identifying the potential uses for the dredge material, the timing of shoaling, the placement activity requiring the same type of dredging equipment as the channel construction would, the sediment compatibility, permitting, funding, cost sharing from stakeholders. But we're committed to ensuring that our navigation program is meeting our mission, and that includes environmentally sustainable waterborne transportation systems.
There have been several major shocks to the maritime logistics systems in recent years, from the widening and more recently reduced water levels in the Panama Canal to COVID and its continued impact on the maritime industry, supply chain, and trade patterns. What are you and your team monitoring today? What are the big picture trends that could significantly impact trade patterns and in turn dredging needs in the coming 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so generally our channels and waterways are in good condition, but we were all impacted by COVID and the supply chain issues over the last couple years. Many of the ports around the country had vessels in long queues waiting to load and unload cargo. We believe it's still going to take a couple years to fully realize as the changes as landside infrastructure adapts from those lessons learned, where they shift goods distribution, expand or rearrange staging, and transfer off to rail or truck. In that longer game, we always have eyes on the Northwest Passage in the Arctic. Climate change has done away with the permanent ice up there, and the routes across Canada's northern border are becoming more frequent. That water is naturally deep and will require less dredging in general, but that route is faster and without the size constraints of the Panama Canal. So we would anticipate to see even larger vessels calling on American ports.
It seems like there's been a decided uptick in dredging activity over the past 5 years. How do you see it?
I think that's a fair statement. Partially, those upticks in dredging can be attributed to our ongoing deepening work. In the O&M portfolio, as I mentioned, we have some of the cleanest channels and harbors that we've had in many years. That's evidenced by fewer channel restrictions and less shoaling in our comparative channel condition surveys. Uh, so, as I mentioned earlier, Congress has been making substantial investments in the Corps' navigation mission. That's really allowed us to address our dredging needs for those smaller channels and waterways and get further into our portfolio. So that uptick in dredging is likely directly connected to Congress's support of the navigation mission.
Let's take a closer look at the Corps' dredging fleet. Will you give the big picture on the age and condition of the fleet?
Yeah, so the Corps owns and operates four hopper dredges. Three were built in the early 1980s, so they're in their 40s. The fourth is the hopper dredge McFarland, and that vessel was built in 1967 and is currently being recapitalized. When the replacement for the McFarland is complete, the McFarland will be retired, and the new dredge will assume that McFarland's position in the ready reserve fleet. Our fleet also has three dustpan dredges that work in the Mississippi River. The Hurley was built in 1993, so it's relatively young. The Potter and Jadwin were built in 1932 and 1933, respectively, so they're in their early 90s, but still digging strong during the low water episodes in the Mississippi River for the last few years. We are in the midst of reviewing the timeline for the and life cycle replacement of all of our government-owned dredges. We also have a pipeline dredge that works in the upper Mississippi, two special purpose dredges that work in the small inlets and channels along the east and Gulf Coast, and one side caster dredge that only works in North Carolina.
Will you please give an overview on the number, types, value of new dredgers on orders today, as well as an insight on what is planned to be ordered in the coming 24 months?
In addition to the core hopper dredge, the McFarland I just mentioned, our industry partners have spent over $2 billion on capital investments in the commercial dredging fleet since 2018. There are three newer hoppers that are in service and two new hoppers expected to be delivered this year. This is significant in a market where 60% of the commercial hopper fleet is 40 plus years old. There have been six large cutter head pipeline dredges, several new scows, and a tendon plant that have been added to the fleet, both modernizing the capability and improving the capacity. Additionally, one company invested in innovative multicats to make stringing pipeline together safer for their crew. Safety and our people are the utmost importance to both the Corps and to our dredging industry partners.
Let's look towards the future. I know priorities can change, but from where you sit today, what are the really big projects that you see on the horizon, maybe in the next 10 to 5 years, that will most dramatically impact this industry going forward?
It's difficult to say with certainty, but we can look at our portfolio and the projects that are going through feasibility phase now to determine what depths and widths are within the federal interest. We have about 9 projects under study in that feasibility phase. Once Congress gives us the go ahead to do a study, we evaluate what dimensions of a channel would produce the highest economic, environmental, and public safety returns to the nation. That study would lead Congress to potentially give us the authority and appropriations to construct the new project. Many times those projects have future implications on our O&M program because the greater dimensions potentially result in greater dredging demand. With a heavy concentration of those studies going on in the Gulf, we would anticipate that would be one of those areas where we would be looking for a higher dredging demand. And as vessels transiting the Panama Canal continue to get larger, there will also be that race to dredge deeper and wider.